Hey everybody, good to be with you again. So we're looking at the theme here of Exodus. And with that, our host text that I'm pointing out on the screen, Acts chapter 9, 31 through 43. And these particular stories are speaking of some healing events in which Peter is raising a lame man back to walk again. And then, of course, Tabitha, a more true expression of the concept of what I'm entitling this lesson here, that death ends in resurrection. In the center of the screen, I'm recording one of my favorite passages from Isaiah chapter 35, verses 1 through 7, speaking of the new and final Exodus that will come in the days of Messiah. You've heard me quote it many times, but I will just point out a few things here. That this new Exodus is meant to be seen like a return back to Eden itself, right? That as they traipse through the wilderness, the dry land will be glad, the desert will rejoice and blossom like a wildflower, abundantly teeming now with life. And then, of course, we're going to see water gushing out in the wilderness where there was no water to be had. There's going to be streams and pools of water all over the place. And in the middle of this, we're going to see that not only does the splendor of Carmel and Sharon begin to erupt forth again as the glory of God returns, but the proclamation of strengthening the weakened hands and the steadying the shaking knees, saying to the cowardly, be strong and do not fear, because their God, their vengeance is indeed coming to save them. And by virtue of this will be something of a sign, I suppose, to accompany it, because it literally proves to be true in Jesus' own day through his ministry, that the eyes of the blind will be open, ears of the deaf unstopped, lame will leap like deer, tongue of the mute will sing. And of course, it goes on further to talk about water gushing and streams popping up in the wilderness and a life erupting forth, even in the areas where jackals live and death pervades in those haunts. So all that to say, when we share Luke and Acts together in commonality, we understand that there are many, many sequences going on through those books that are riddled with the concept of death followed by resurrection. And not in every situation do we actually see a real picture of death ending in resurrection, or I should say a real moment of death, but perhaps a picture of death is what we're looking at. The first example I give you on the left side of the screen with Jesus in his hometown synagogue is, of course, he is sentenced to death when he talks about how he is the fulfillment of those scriptures, and then, of course, gives the examples of how God worked in the days of both Elijah and Elisha to Gentiles, and he's going to be doing so in the same time that they live in as this scripture is being fulfilled, that it seems to be an open-ended invitation for Gentiles to become part of the kingdom and whatnot. All this going on here, taking into consideration that they know this Jesus, or at least they think they do, the fact that he grew up amongst them and yet he would say such things about himself, they take it as blasphemy and they want to hurl him off a cliff, but Jesus is delivered from this. He just simply walks through the crowd and they do nothing. So sentenced to death, yet his time had not come, and he was indeed resurrected from that picture of death. Right after this, we have a leper who comes to Jesus. He's cleansed, but of course, the leprosy itself is a grave picture of exile, because they truly are exiled from their local communities and the nation. They can walk around in the deserted places, but are not allowed to walk on crowded roads or be anywhere near where people live or congregate, because of the fact they are a living picture of slow, burning death. But with Jesus healing this man, he is rescuing him from that exile, right? Then we move just a couple chapters later, and we have a woman who is only mentioned in Luke's gospel, who is referred to here as the widow of Nain, whose son Jesus raises back to life again. And then the very next chapter, a girl who is raised, that's Jairus' daughter. In the sequence, she starts out sick, but dies before the story ends, before Jesus has even made it to Jairus' house. And then a woman who's been bleeding for 12 years, who is the picture of death leaking from her body as blood, life-giving fluid, is leaking out of her body. And then she too is healed and restored. Then, of course, in the couple of chapters that ensue afterwards, Jesus then will tell this generation that they want a sign. He will give them a sign, but it will be one of Jonah. Well, what's at the heart of Jonah's story, right? When we get into Jonah chapter 2. But it's a picture of the death and resurrection of Jonah when he sinks to the abyss in the depths of Sheol, that he calls to God and God delivers him from those and spits him out of the belly of the fish, who comes up on the dry land to vomit Jonah out. And then, of course, Jonah is revived and receives life again, to then be pointed in the direction of God's mission to the people he's sending him to. Then in Luke 16, we have the unique story of Lazarus, found only in Luke's gospel, where Lazarus dies. This Lazarus is not raised like the Lazarus of John chapter 11, but indeed, Lazarus, when he goes to Abraham's bosom, finds life. And what happens very shortly after this story is a blind man who is restored, having his sight given back to him again. So while you might say, well, the Lazarus story kind of breaks that pattern because he dies and he stays dead, this is true. But the idea is that he finds life in the place where those who follow the Old Testament pattern of faith as patterned by the patriarchs passed down to them find themselves in the place called Abraham's bosom, unlike the place where the rich man will find himself. And that, of course, is in the tormenting flames of Gehenna. How do we see this paralleled over here in the book of Acts? Great question. So we start with Acts chapter 3. Peter and John, they heal a lame man, held at a distance from God because he can't go any further into the temple precincts than the actual gate where they sit him at to have to beg for alms in order to just buy him some morsels of food, right? And then Peter and John, by virtue of their action there, are delivered over to the Sanhedrin where they're interrogated, but they are delivered out from the Sanhedrin fully intact and no worse for the wear by virtue of that. Then eventually the apostles are delivered from jail. So as the persecution intensifies and gets worse, the Spirit continues to do miraculous things, such as opening jail cells and allowing them to completely walk out of them. First, the company of the apostles, then it will be Peter later on when Peter truly is sentenced to death. Then we have Stephen martyred, but by virtue of that, Saul is delivered from his blindness. So the persecution and martyrdom of one is what leads to the life of another, because Saul was consenting to Stephen's death, but by virtue of the fact he was standing there and it filled him with the rage he had to want to hunt down these followers of the way, it was on the Damascus road that Christ meets him, and he himself is converted, but delivered through the corridor of his blindness to then receive his true sight, his true spiritual sight, and then live the life of victory in Jesus rather than persecuting Jesus that comes afterward. Then in the next story of where we're at right now, a paralyzed man is made whole by Peter, and then Dorcas is also raised to life. And then soon, sadly, James is going to be martyred, but Peter will be delivered from jail, whereas one has one trajectory to follow, and James ultimately ascends to life as now he will rejoin Jesus in the place that Jesus has went to. Peter is spared for a time and continues on with his journey. Paul is even stoned to die, but then again, he's raised to walk right afterwards. They stone him, drag him out of the city, leave him for dead, but then some hours later, Paul gets back up, shakes the dirt off, goes back into the city and continues to do what he was sent there to do in evangelizing. So a lot of this to show, again, the over-redundancy of the pattern of death ending, not so much in death in every case. In most cases, it's a picture of death that ends in the giving of life. And the point behind that is to simply demonstrate to us the clear understanding of what the central crux of both of these volumes are, and that is Jesus' own death followed by his resurrection, and how the announcement of the kingdom blossoms into the arrival of the kingdom and how that impacts human history. So I hope that's been helpful. And of course, more to follow in the next session.